Hello and welcome, I'm Olas Garjuk and you're watching Head to Head with UATV. French President Emmanuel Macron met with Russia's President Vladimir Putin in southern France on August 19th, a week before the G7 summit. The talks lasted 2.5 hours and touched upon the Syrian crisis, the Iran nuclear deal and prospects for a four-way summit on the situation in eastern Ukraine. To discuss this, we welcome to our studio today Petro Burkovskiy, analyst and head of Center for Advanced Russia Studies at the National Institute for Strategic Studies. Helen, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks for coming. So Macron invited Putin to his summer residence, and somehow this visit coincides with the G7 summit. Could you please explain us what is Macron's real interest?
Well, Macron, as a host of the G7, wants to create an environment to show to Vladimir Putin that West is not hostile toward him, and West do not want a further confrontation with Russia, which clearly sends signals that it's ready to, or it is not afraid of. To relaunch the arms races and to relaunch the nuclear races. At the same time, the major European powers like Germany and France, of course Great Britain, they are right now in a situation of economic stagnation, and they do not want this kind of escalation and arms race. Of course, they have other aims to use their resources and to use their budgets. Therefore, I think, and it's in the national interest of the France, to build a stable line of communication with the Russian president in order not
and the rest of the world.
Maybe not the rest of the world, but between the Russia and the West.
Okay.
And to show to Mr. Putin that there are constructive, although how to say, prudent and cautious, but constructive to say partners on the West who are ready to listen to him, maybe not to be coerced by Putin, but to listen to certain of his demands and to think how to find ways to meet these demands. Therefore, thus they were discussing the Syrian crisis, which directly link not only to the migration problem, but also to the situation with the oil prices, global oil prices. That's why they are, for the same reason, they are discussing the Iran situation and the consequences of U.S. withdrawal and the current escalation, U.S. withdrawal from the treaty, Iran nuclear treaty, and the current escalation in the Strait of Hormuz. And of course, they have to discuss the Ukrainian-Russian conflict and look for the way how not to let this conflict escalate and develop into something more hazardous.
I understand you. I get your point. So basically what you mean is that France wants to build an image of an effective mediator in the dialogue between Russia and the West before the G7 summit, and maybe somehow to show the allied countries its power and its value as a participant of this dialogue. But what are Putin's interest in developing these negotiations or taking part in these negotiations?
Well, let me only partly agree with you. It's not only about image. If escalation is avoided, that would mean that there is a space for economic cooperation, and this is the point which is of the most interest for the France. If you look at the figure of French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Jean-Yves Le Drian, he was former Minister of Defense, and he was a very pragmatic proponent of enhancing ties, trade ties and military ties between France and Russia before Ukrainian crisis. He was one of the proponents of selling Mistral carriers to Russia. And now this pragmatic also was appointed to position of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and France looked for the ways of this de-escalation as a mean to pursue their own economic goals. Therefore, they are looking for the ways how to diffuse the crisis between Russia and Ukraine, and maybe it would be the way to lift sanctions. But of course, there are a lot of complex issues about lifting or keeping sanctions, because
strengthening sanctions.
Sanctions, because not everything depends on France, Germany, and Russia. A lot depends on Ukraine.
Of course. Okay, we will discuss the Ukrainian part in this later. We have a soundbite from Emmanuel Macron that he voiced at the press conference ahead of the meeting with Vladimir Putin. Let's watch.
Of course, we are also going to talk about Ukraine, where the choices made by Ukrainian President Zelensky really changed the situation, I believe. In close cooperation with President Zelensky and Chancellor Merkel, we'll consider the opportunity for, and this is my hope, a new summit in the Normandy format in the next few weeks if we manage to lay out a way forward. We called this summer for freedom of protest, freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, and the freedom to run in elections, which should be fully respected in Russia, like for any member of the Council of Europe.
So basically, French President Emmanuel Macron hopes on resuming this format of Normandy negotiations together with Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky. Do you believe that in several weeks we can await another round of talks?
Frankly speaking, I do not think that there will be a new round of talks, and for several reasons. First of all, every time the West makes a symbolical step toward Russia, for instance, it allowed Russia to come back to the Council of Europe.
To Parliamentary Assembly.
And just after this, in less than 2 months, Russian authorities cracked down on a protest in Moscow and showed that there will be no free and fair elections, which is one of the principles of Council of Europe. That means that Russia is not going to bow to Western pressure and not going to follow Western norms of rules if it doesn't help it to pursue its own national interests, whether it's national security interests or foreign policy interests. This is the first point. Second point, if you read Vladimir Putin's recent rhetoric, he said that everything in Ukraine is the result of unconstitutional coup d'etat. He reiterated his position just a month ago, and that means that Russian authorities have not changed their stance on the Ukrainian crisis.
Right.
They continue to think that it's an internal affair of Ukraine. It's not an international affair. And therefore, third point, Russia looks at the Normandy format as a tool to put pressure on Ukraine, while the West and Ukraine see it as a tool how to
keep negotiations going somehow.
Not only this, but only to help Russia to exit the conflict without major losses.
So this is the way to help Russia exit the conflict, I mean, to get out of this conflict.
Yes, because they understand that Russia is a major power, a nuclear power, and it will not... well, if you want to put your will on a major power, it means that you have to defeat it militarily. Nobody looks for the ways to defeat Russia militarily, no way, right now in the West. And they're just looking for the ways how to persuade Russia. How to make a workable settlement, peace settlement or peace resolution, conflict resolution in Ukraine, which would keep Ukraine independent and sovereign, while would satisfy certain Russian interest. I think this is, as Churchill said, it's a puzzle wrapped in enigma and covered by a mystery. I don't know how it can be done, but still, this is one of the major, drivers behind the Normandy format. And the threat for Ukraine, which is very important, the threat for Ukraine is that from time to time in 2016, in 2015, the West tried to find a compromise with Russia, but at the cost of Ukrainian interests.
That is true. It looks like Ukrainian interests and sovereignty and territorial integrity doesn't really comply with the interests from Russia, which means that the aim, if you're saying that the aim of this Normandy format is somehow to facilitate this resolution of the conflict, but not to lose Russia's interests, makes it, I mean, it just means that it's not possible, it's not realistic. I want also to outline Vladimir Putin's reaction. So, Russian president voiced support for the format, for the Normandy format negotiations involving France, Germany, Ukraine, and Russia for parties. But he said that phone conversations with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky had given him cautious grounds for optimism. And cautious is a quote. So basically, Putin told Macron that he doesn't see any kind of alternative way for some kind of dialogue with Ukraine except of the Normandy format. But at the same time, he didn't assure his willing to participate in that dialogue, didn't he? I just want to ask, what is the game that Vladimir Putin plays right now? What is his interest in participating in these talks with Emmanuel Macron, touching on Ukrainian issues and further?
First of all, Russia has to continue to be involved in the Normandy format in order to show to the supporters of Russia among Western elites, among elites in France, for instance, Marine Le Pen, or in Italy, which raise their voices for lifting of the sanctions. And they are saying that Russia is important and Russia behaves in constructive way. At the same time, they close their eyes on the facts of direct and uncovered military aggression. This is the first point. Just to pretend that you are constructive in order to have image of somebody who can follow the rules and who deserves that Russia deserves sanctions to be lifted. The second point of Putin, why he said it's a cautious optimism. If you look back several months ago during the presidential and parliamentary election campaign, Russian president several times repeated that Zelensky became president under the slogans and due to the promises of bringing peace to Donbas. And in Russian interpretation, you can bring peace to Donbas only if you will enter into direct negotiation with separatists in occupied Donetsk and Luhansk, and if you agree to grant special status to Donetsk and Luhansk. And these 2 points, direct talks and autonomous or special autonomous status for the occupied territories, they were discussed earlier in the Normandy format. However, Germany and France, in the last 3 years, they saw that Russia has done everything to keep the low-intensity conflict. So Russia doesn't want to bring stable peace on the ground, and therefore it's impossible to begin a political process. With the with the elections of the new president and the new parliament, and we will have a new government, Russia hopes that it will obtain kind of new leverages over the new Ukrainian authorities, or they try to pretend that they have this kind of leverage, and therefore they would force new Ukrainian authorities to accept these 2 points, direct talks and autonomous status.
Now it's the time to ask you about Ukraine's role in this. You said that lots of things depend on Ukraine's behavior right now and Ukraine's position and stance. So how would you evaluate what is happening right now, the situation that is happening right now, and maybe you could voice some recommendations for the Ukrainian diplomats, maybe how to kind of improve and...
Well, I think that diplomats has already know what they should do. What we can say definitely is that despite the just very critical crucial change of power in Ukraine, we can say that it's total reset of power in Ukraine. We have a very new president, new parliament. Despite these facts, we can see that there will be no major changes, that nobody is going to make a major concessions. For the time being, it's very clear, and Zelensky made it very clear, that he will not enter into direct negotiations, and he is not thinking about the granting a special status. Moreover, he said that the new media company, Russian-speaking media company or broadcaster, would be established in order to, to reshape opinion of people on the occupied territories and maybe to influence opinion in Russia. He said that he will grant passports to people who are intimidated and persecuted in Russia. So these are steps which are clearly showing that
he's ready to retaliate.
Yes, to react, and he is not going to give in to Putin.
And basically, the last issue, just to close on the topic, because we ran out of time, unfortunately. So as far as I understand from our conversation, the Normandy format has proven its ineffectiveness, basically, as together as Minsk talks. And would you see any kind of possible ways to resume the talks in an effective way? Because I remember President Volodymyr Zelensky voiced his idea of adding the United States to the table and also the United Kingdom. What do you think of this?
Well, what I would say that Normandy format played a very important role in keeping conflict low and not allowing it to develop into the full-scale war. This is very important.
Mm-hmm.
And
so it's not ineffective.
No, in 2015, it was quite important to have French president and German president together with Ukrainian president in Minsk, who together tried to persuade Putin to stop his troops and to stop the full-scale war in Ukraine. And actually, they succeeded. It was a result.
Of course, but we were talking about the present situation. We just have one more minute of time. Could you please be more brief?
So right now, it's impossible to see the ways how to improve the talks or to improve the situation on the ground, because Russia clearly shows that it doesn't want to let Ukraine integrate with the West, with the European Union, or also with the North Atlantic Treaty Organizations. So there is no way. The only function that can be used during the Normandy format is just trying to contain Putin and trying to understand his intentions in the short term, and not just continue to persuade him that the full-scale war in Ukraine is not in Russian interests, is not in Ukrainian interest, and is not in European interest. Mm-hmm. So far, these are very limited tasks, but they are a little bit less or more realistic. All other tasks during the current regime in Russia, I think it's impossible to say that they will be realistic.
Well, thank you so much for voicing this interesting opinion. Let's see how the situation is going to evolve and if the next summit of Normandy format will eventually take place or will not. Let's see what happens. Thank you so much for being a guest today in our studio.
Yeah, my pleasure.
That was Petro Burkovskiy, analyst and head of Center for Advanced Russia Studies at the National Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you for watching Head to Head, and stay tuned for more with UATV.